2 Samuel chapter 13. We began chapter 13 last week. We began it last week, and we looked at the first few verses, but there are some more things that we can say, more comments that we can make, and then we'll move through the first 15 verses. Not repeating everything that we looked at last week, but here we see the first effects of David's sin on his life, and it is tragic and it is sad. The effects of sin, of course, God's in control. He's sovereign as to how pervasive and how damaging the effects of sin will be. And in this case, it is because of the nature of David's sin, adultery, and then murder, then one can't reasonably expect that it would be minimal kind of impact on his own family, and it's not a minimal impact on his family. Commentaries have found in this incident a virtual playground for connections to David and Amnon. They connect David and Amnon in various ways. Guilt is assigned to varying degrees according to the level of responsibility issued to David. So David gets a lot of the blame if the writer thinks that David was the source of all of this, or vice versa for Amnon. There's a commentator, Fogelman. He makes a close connection between chapter 11 and chapter 13. Remember, chapter 11 is when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. Now, chapter 13 is when his son commits adultery with his half-sister in this case. So he says, David and Amnon are birds of a feather, lustful characters cut from the same cloth who, when visually stimulated by a beautiful woman, invariably become a prey of sexual lust. Another commentator remarks that Amnon is dominated by the same sensuality as his father. Sin is definitely passed from one generation to another, and there are 3 or 4 different ideas or explanations as to how sin is passed on. Remember, Adam became a sinner, and Adam passed that sin on, and there are different ideas on how that sin was passed on. And most people that you and I will be familiar with will take a view called the federal headship view, which means the sin is passed through the father. So from Adam to all his sons, Cain and Abel and Seth, that sin line is transferred through the father's line. And one reason why many people take the federal headship view is they say that it was Mary, and of course Jesus came through Mary, and so Jesus was perfect. He was innocent. He had no sin nature. He came through the woman, so they kind of reverse that and think that because Joseph was not involved in this, that's one of the arguments for a federal headship. So people like that would say all of humanity was represented in Adam. And when Adam fell, all of humanity fell with Adam. And it has many good points. Much better, many better arguments than the other views have. So sin is passed from one generation to another. No doubt about that. But the particular expression of sin is completely on the individual. Amnon was not destined to be an adulterer or immorality or to rape. It wasn't that Amnon was destined to do that because his dad did that. Though sin nature is passed on, the particular expression of that sin is completely on the individual. And another writer sees a connection by means of teaching and learning. This writer, his name is David Payne, he actually says that David taught his son to yield to lust and to use violence if need be. Now, that's just a ridiculous position to take. Though there are parallels clearly that exist between chapter 11 and chapter 13, this account that we're reading about in chapter 13 is darker than the account in chapter 11. It is darker. And we answered the question last week, why include this embarrassing piece of family history at all in this section here? And the answer was, foremost is the writer's intent that readers know God's Word. They know that what God said, in this case through Nathan. Nathan came to David and confronted him in sin and said, the sword will not depart from your family, and all of these things are going to happen because you have sinned. Well, the writer wants the readers to know that God's Word is true. David's house is going to suffer because of his sin. And this episode helps, sin is a serious matter to God, and God will keep His word. A second reason that we noted last week is this episode has influence on Absalom's actions later. There's no vacuum out of which actions emerge here. These things, as you can see, are going to affect Absalom. So we're giving this detail, and it helps us to understand his coup attempt on his father a couple of chapters later. Because Tamar, the girl who is raped, is his sister. So Absalom is involved in here, and so there's another reason why the writer would include this is so that we can understand what Absalom's role in all of this. And it helps to explain later devious motives that we read about. The third reason is that the readers face a real event where the sins of one generation imprint the second generation, the next generation. If it happened once, it can happen again. God is capable of doing that. The writer wanted his readers to remember that and to know that. We noted last week that this whole event is portrayed through Tamar's eyes, through her perspective. And so we see the trauma, we see the manipulation, we see the violence, we see the debilitating loss of the sense of self, the display of grief and mourning, the shame, the degradation. We see all of that because we're being told this story primarily from her perspective. Amnon was frustrated. Remember when we talked about that last week? Verse 2, Amnon was so frustrated because of his sister. Frustrated means has the idea of constrained or narrow. In other words, he's being restricted. He wants to do something. He wants to have sex with his sister, and he feels constrained. He can't do that, and that's making him frustrated. I mean, the text is extremely clear. He made himself ill. Why? For she was a virgin, and it seemed hard to Amnon to do anything to her. So he made himself sick, so to speak, over this whole issue. In verses 3 through 5, it says that Amnon had a friend. Friends are not always what they are cracked up to be. Had a friend. The word, I don't remember if we actually covered this last week or not, but that word friend there has the widest possible or the broadest possible application of all the words that are used for friend and family and different kind of relationship words. It's used for a friend, it's used for a neighbor, an associate, whether they're close or whether they're just occasional. It has the broadest of application within the root family of all these kinds of words. So it's translated companion in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 13, and it's translated neighbor in Exodus chapter 21. He had a friend, and his name was Jonadab. Jonadab means Yahweh is generous. Now, and Jonadab was the son of David's brother. We talked about this last week. Shammah was one of the brothers that went with Saul to fight the Philistines. And Shammah's son is Jonadab right here. This is him. It says that Jonadab, let's see how the text say this. The son of Shammah, David's brother, and Jonadab was very shrewd man. He was a very shrewd man. Now this I know we didn't cover last week. The word shrewd here is the word wisdom, hakam. You see that word, it's like 46 times in the book of Proverbs. So the question is how does it get translated shrewd here? Why doesn't it say Jonadab, who is a wise man? Well, outside of the word hakam means to be skilled, to be experienced, to live wisely. And like we said, 46 times it's in Proverbs. Outside of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, wisdom refers to skills in relation to craft work and the giving of advice or shrewd counsel. So when you get outside of the poetic books, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, when you see someone or read about someone who is skilled, it means that they are like Fred Sterrett. They can put together a real nice pulpit and communion table, and it looks good. He's skilled. That's what this word means when you get outside of those books. Or shrewd counsel. For example, the woman of Tekoa. If you look at chapter 14 across the page of chapter 14 and verse 2, it says, "So Joab sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there and said to her, 'Please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments now.'" So here is shrewd counsel, this woman of Tekoa, and what she's going to do. And in chapter 20 of this book, in verses 14 through 16, there's going to be another woman that's going to offer shrewd counsel. There are times when cleverness can deteriorate into deviousness. What I mean by devious is, you've heard of the expression streetwise or worldly wise. There are kids sometimes, and there are people that are streetwise. They know how to work a system. They know how to go, or they can wind their way around the system. They're streetwise, they're worldly wise. They know just what to say, they know just who to say it to in order to get what they want. So sometimes cleverness can deteriorate into devious. And one example is here that we read about in chapter 13. Jonadab's solid strategy to advance an evil outcome. In other words, Jonadab is too clever for his own good. You ever heard somebody say that? He's too smart for his own good. He uses his brains to figure out things that don't benefit anybody, and he figures out a way of staying out of trouble while it doesn't benefit everybody. You know people like that. I've known people like that. I know people like that today. So Jonadab's solid strategy to advance an evil outcome. His solid strategy is given there in verse 5. He said to him, "Lie down on your bed, pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please let my sister Tamar come and give me some food to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat from her hand.'" That's his strategy. It's going to work. His solid strategy to advance an evil outcome. Another of the same type was the advice of Ahithophel that he gave to Absalom in a few chapters. In chapter 16, in verse 23, this is during the time when Absalom is about to overtake his father David and take over the kingdom. It says here, "The advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded both by David and Absalom." But Ahithophel is on the wrong side. Ahithophel is not on David's side. He's on Absalom's side. So here you have a man, Ahithophel and Jonadab, that we might say, these guys are too smart for their own good. Which means they find a way to get something done, regardless of the ethics and regardless of the impact. They find a way to wiggle their way around and get it done without getting in trouble, so to speak. An example of inferior strategy that brings about good is in the accounts of Hushai in 2 Samuel chapter 16 through the first half, or if not all of chapter 17, the first half of chapter 17. So you have examples of a solid strategy to advance an evil outcome, and then you have examples of inferior strategy that brings about good. And that account is in 2 Samuel 16 and verse 15 and following. And we'll look more at that when we get in those chapters. Wisdom, as biblically conceived, was wide enough to encompass both of these things. But the Bible doesn't necessarily the Bible gives them a name, wisdom. But there is wisdom that can present a solid strategy for an evil outcome, or wisdom that has a solid strategy for a good outcome, or even bad strategy that will result in good. All of that's lumped under wisdom. So when we see Jonadab was a very shrewd man, he's too smart for his own good. He's figured out a solid strategy in order for Amnon to get what he wants. Who would suspect? Pretend to be sick. You look sick already. You've made yourself sick by worrying and fretting about all this. Just pretend to be sick, lay down, call David. What's David going to do? He hears of one of his kids sick, he's going to come running, right? And you want your sister Tamar to come in there and fix a few things for you? Have her come in here and fix a few things. And what's Tamar going to do? Dutifully obey her father. It's a flawless strategy. And why would Tamar think anything when Amnon says, tell everybody else to go out? Now, why would she think anything? That's her half-brother. Flawless strategy for an evil outcome equals shrewd, too good, too smart for your own good. That kind of thing. Those kind of people are very dangerous. Israel will become, at some point in the future, from this time here, Israel will become so senseless that God will state of them, He will say this about them. And this is Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 22. He will say, they are shrewd to do evil. They are skilled to do evil. They had gotten to the point where they, streetwise, worldly-wise, have figured out a way of doing things that gets around the law, that keeps them out of trouble, and they still accomplish what they wish to do. They are shrewd to do evil. So the influence, when we read about this, and we see the influence of shrewd, when we read that he's a shrewd man, this is like a suspicious shadow over friend. He had a friend, and he with friend was very shrewd. Well, they were a friend in the sense of, they wanted the same thing. Neither one of them had many scruples about them. Neither one of them really was guided by the law, as Israel lived under the law. It was not a major factor in their decision. They knew the law. They had to know the law because they had to figure out a way to get around the law. That's why they had to know it. So the influence of shrewd is like a suspicious shadow over friend. It makes us suspicious of the word friend there. And if you're a wise parent and you read this, you are now alerted. Are you not? My flags are up. My flags are up. The words are true, and Amnon proves to be a shady character. The advice he gives to his cousin cannot be perceived as prudent or discreet. That is, the advice that Jonadab gives to Amnon cannot be perceived as prudent and discreet at all. One writer is convinced that Jonadab knew full well the ultimate outcome of his counsel. Concocting, well, I mean, Jonadab did know because Amnon told him, I'm all bent out of shape because I want to have relations with my half-sister. I can't. She's a virgin. I'm just all broken up about this. Jonadab knows. So here's what you need to do. So I think it's reasonable for us to think that Jonadab knew exactly what he was doing. Concocting a scenario that aims at putting an unsuspecting girl in a room with a silent stalker is stupid. Later in the chapter, Jonadab knows too much information about Absalom's vengeful murder of Amnon. We talked about that a little bit last week, remember? When Absalom kills all his other brothers, Jonadab is back in the king's court with the king. The king hears about it, and for some reason, Jonadab knows all the details about it. Now, how is that? He's a shady character. This man is poison. Absalom seems to have planned revenge from the beginning. Absalom's response to this, rather than call attention to the disgraceful incident, he advises his sister Tamar to keep silent. Keep silent is what he says to her. He says that down in verse 20. He and Absalom, that is Jonadab and Absalom, collaborated to eliminate Amnon and did so with skill, deviousness. Skill or deviousness is skill in the devious kind of side, employing a weakness of Amnon, and that was alcohol. And we'll see that as we get down through the chapter. You know, when we get down to verses 6 and 7, especially verse 7, David sent to the house for Tamar, saying, go to your brother's house. So apparently, many of the older sons were granted the privilege of having their own residence in the city of David, especially verse 8. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house. So maybe being the sons of the king, they had this privilege. And the plan seemed reasonable to Amnon, and he began to implement it. So, as we noted a while ago, naturally, when a father hears of illness in his children, he investigates. And Amnon says to his father, I request these things, and he followed the advice of Jonadab to the letter. To the letter. Even have her come so that she can make these cakes in my sight. He even says that, in my sight. So we are puzzled at this point. We're puzzled because we know the rest of the story. But still, we're puzzled. Did David not see anything alarming or unusual in this request? Have her, why do you want Tamar? You have lots of sisters, no doubt. You want her. Why only her? Well, evidently, David didn't see anything alarming or unusual in this request. So David here, nothing is said about him. David's just kind of like the man who hands the baton and kind of puts his hands up. So David is either presented as innocent to the point of gross naivety, or blind to a degree that stretches credulity. Neither quality's much esteemed in an astute ruler. But the writer doesn't tell us anything about David and how he didn't see. We don't have his opinion. We don't have his insight into the situation at all. So verse 7, David issued an order which appears to have been voiced in haste without due thought or consideration. And this section in verse 15 ends with that same kind of order. It's the same Hebrew word. When David says, go, Go now, go to your brother. The word go there is a command. It's the same verb, the same word that you see in verse 15 when he says, just before verse 16, get up, go away. So verse 7 has that command, verse 15 has the command, which tells us this 7 through 15 is a little section, a complete thought or a scene that's given there. On the later occasion where we see this, in verse 15, Amnon that's a response in anger and a domineering kind of attitude. And of course, the one in the middle was Tamar. Here's the way the writer presented it. Verse 7, David tells Tamar to go there. Verse 15, Amnon tells Tamar to get out. In the middle, Tamar is bounced around. Now, this has to be commented upon by liberals. This has to be an example of oppression of women that's brought out in ancient Israelite culture. So, and we'll see that in just a moment here. But this story is about the effects of sin in David's family. Look, leaders do not make good decisions when sin has influence. It clouds their thinking. The point of the story here is not to criticize men or men in leadership, or that leadership has too much power. There's commentaries that I read that say, well, in this day, here's the writer's commentary on the authority that kings had, the too heavy-handed authority that kings had. This is not a commentary on the authority of kings. It's about the effects of sin in David's family. One commentator here, Mark Gray, seems to construe this story as one example of old societal values once again minimalizing and marginalizing women. He writes, the impression is thereby created that through obeying the orders of family authority figures, father and an older brother, she has been reduced to a situation of bitter, aimless despair. Bad leadership. Leadership should go away. On the basis of this analysis, it thus emerges that at one of its deepest analysis, this story is dealing with the depiction of the process whereby Tamar's humanity is obliterated. And it's all leadership's fault. It's all the fault of those in authority, which is a classic example of reading your own agenda into a passage. It's not about that at all. Dutiful is not a vice. Tamar responding to her father in the way that she did is not wrong. That doesn't make David bad. She did what her father asked her to do. Obedience is not a flaw. Why is obedience a flaw? Well, readers know the full story, and they lay blame on David or culture here. The culture of the day, it was oppressive to women, or it was David. That's why all this happened. No, being dutiful is not a vice. Obedience is not a flaw. It's good. So, verses 8 through 11. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down, and she took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in her sight, and baked the cakes. She took the pan and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat, and Amnon said, "Have everyone go out from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said, "Come, lie with me, my sister." Stop right there. She was happy to grant her brother's request. Tamar is very happy to do this. The writer doesn't tell us what Tamar thought whether she was uncomfortable or not uncomfortable, but there's nothing to indicate anything but that she was willing and happy to grant her brother's requests. Initially, as we read there, you could see that he refused to eat. And the first hint that something was wrong was when she entered his home, he was lying down. He was lying down, verse 8. The bedroom is the centerpiece in this section. Did you notice it? When we get through reading verses 7 through 15, you're going to see that the bedroom is the centerpiece in this section. And Amnon was like his father in some sinful expressions, but Amnon represented kind of an advancement in this kind of sin. Something of a shift in consciousness had taken place between the generations, it seems. David represents the old guard who were too perpetually on the run to have time for self-indulgent inactivity. They were fighting wars, they were doing things, and all kinds of things were going on. But Amnon symbolizes the rise of people, David's sons. They didn't have to go out and fight. They didn't have to go out and shepherd like David did. They had time on their hands. Lots of time on their hands. Too much time. Then comes a surprising order from Amnon. Have everyone go out from me. All of you get out of my presence, essentially is what he's saying. A sense of shame must have gripped Amnon. He knew the evilness at work in his heart. He did not welcome the accountability of an audience. Why couldn't she serve him cakes with the servants, one or two servants standing around? That should be another flag. He must have had a sense of shame. He didn't want the accountability. Have everyone go out from me is the exact reproduction of the words spoken by Joseph just before he revealed himself to his brothers in Genesis chapter 45 and verse 1. Remember, he says to all his servants, go out, and then he says, I am your brother Joseph. You have the same thing here. Go out. He wishes to be with her only. He doesn't wish to have anybody else around. He wishes to keep this secret. Another quality of Amnon among the several already evident, is his fondness of ordering others. His fondness of authority. Here in verse 9, he orders a servant to clear the room. Verse 17, he calls his young man to usher Tamar out and lock the door. This resembles what appears to be a spoiled brat who's too smart for his own good. And you wonder why David or somebody did not see this coming. The command, lie with me, my sister, is the same kind of command that we see in Genesis 37:9, where there Potiphar's wife attempts to force Joseph into a relationship. What happens? Verse 12. But she answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not listen to her, since he was stronger than she. He violated her and lay with her. Violate is the word rape. In Genesis chapter 34:2, it's used there. This is the word that Tamar uses herself. Do not violate me, she says in verse 12. It is the word the writer used, like the narrator, the writer used. He used it in verse 14. However, he would not listen to her as he's narrating the story. Since he was stronger than her, he violated her. So, is Tamar, does she have a case? Was she really raped? She uses the word of herself in verse 12. The writer uses the word in verse 14 and verse 22. Verse 22, but Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. So from the narrator's or the writer's perspective, yeah, he raped her. He uses the word twice. It was the reason Absalom did not speak to Amnon, as we just read there in verse 22. So Absalom was convinced as well. And it is the word that Jonadab uses to describe Amnon's actions. Verse 32, same chapter, verse 32. Jonadab, the son of Shimei, David's brother, responded, "Do not let my lord suppose they have been put to death. They have put to death all the young men, the king's sons. For Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar." That's the case where Jonadab is back in the king's court and he knows too much of what's going on than what he should. So there's no doubt that he raped her. The word violate is the word rape. Tamar used it, the writer used it, Jonadab used it, all refer to this same action. And there are several do nots in this chapter. Did you happen to hear some of those do nots that she says there? Verse 12, she says, "No, my brother, do not violate me." Verse 20, then Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? But now, keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart." There's another do not in verse 28. Absalom commanded his servant, saying, "See now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death. Do not fear, for have not I myself commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." And in verse 28. Verse 32. Jonadab, the son of Shimei, "Do not let my lord suppose." So there are a lot of these do nots in here. It is an appeal to restrain or stop. All of these do nots are a prohibition. They are an appeal to stop, just like they sound. They're not commands. They're not barking orders or anything. It is an appeal. Please, no, my brother, do not violate me. She appealed to his conscience, reminding him that what he was pursuing was a disgraceful thing. Verse 12, this is a disgraceful thing. Do not do this disgraceful thing that should be not done in Israel. In other words, this is a serious crime. It's a serious offense in Israel. And she appealed to the long-term reputation, implications for both of them in verse 13. "As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? I will be known as one who's been raped all my life. You will be known as a fool all your life." This is not worth it here. Where could I get rid of my reproach? In other words, the shame and the contempt would meet me everywhere. It would follow me everywhere. It would be there before I arrive wherever I'm going. And then she says something very odd. She says, "Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." So the question is sex between half-siblings permissible, or is it incestuous? In other words, is it forbidden? Because that's what she implies. Well, the author here describes Tamar as assuming she will be allowed to marry her half-brother. And after the rape, she claims marriage after her due. In other words, down in verse 16 and 17, she appeals to him to, don't cast me off. The wise thing to do now is marry me. So she appeals to him before and after. She appeals to him, look, go through the proper channels, talk to my father, talk to the king. He won't withhold me from you. And after he does this deed, she claims marriage as her due for what has happened to her. For Tamar, then, half-sibling marriage is evidently conscionable, according to her. However, it is reasonable to expect a girl would say, or to expect that a girl would say whatever might free them from the situation, even if they know that the truth is, the king will not give me to you. So the question is here is she right in making this appeal, or is she just trying to present some argument to get out of the situation? Those are our two choices. So will she say anything to get out of something, whether it's the truth or not necessarily? Yes, no doubt. An older commentary by the name of Colin Delitzsch, which means nothing to you, but that's who it is, wrote this, and this is like 1886, their commentary in 1886, and it's very good. They wrote this. She simply said this, that she might escape from his hands by any means in her power, and to avoid inflaming him still more and driving him to sin by precluding all hope of marriage. We cannot therefore even infer from these words of hers that she really thought the king could grant a dispensation from the existing hindrances in the law to their marriage. That's his case. It's a very, very possible, it's a very good case. Very good case. There's no doubt the law does forbid half-siblings to marry. No question. There's no question about that. Did half-siblings marry, especially those who were in royalty, in order to try to keep the bloodline pure? Oh, yes. Not only in Israel at this time, but down through the ages, where you see the bloodline, people doing that to try to keep, so to speak, keep the bloodline pure. But I'm inclined to think that David would not have allowed this because the law would not have allowed this. Royalty does not mean you're exempt from the law. By his actions, by Amnon's actions, he condemns himself as a man of senseless, a man who is impious, sins of immorality he has committed. There it says in verse 12, one of moral insensibility, one who is disgraceful. That's in verse 13. So in verse 12, she says, but no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel, and do not do this disgraceful thing, this senseless, impious kind of act. And in verse 13, as for me, where can I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. So by his actions, Amnon condemns himself as a man of impiousness, senselessness, and a man of moral insensibility, a man who is disgraceful. And by doing these things, he disqualifies himself from ultimate access to the throne. He would not qualify to reign. So, verse 14, he would not listen to her. Since he was stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Amnon was not willing to listen, the text says. She presented her case. She presented a good case, a very truthful case. Think of the reproach that's going to be on me. Think of the reproach that's going to be on you. This isn't worth it. There are other ways of going about this, is what her suggestion was, probably just to try to get out of the mess she was in. But he was unwilling to listen. He was not willing to listen. He did not agree with her reasons. He did not think that her reasons were valid enough to exercise self-control in this moment. He regarded the desires of his flesh to be a greater treasure. He regarded the desires of his flesh, that they needed to be satisfied, a greater, more valuable act than listening to wisdom, and thus proved himself to be a fool. Proved himself to be disgraceful and a senseless man. He was not willing to listen to her before his disgraceful act, nor after. Verse 16. She said to him, no. He's told her to get up and get away. And we'll look at this next week. But she said to him, no, because this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. Then he called his young man who attended him and said, now throw this woman out of my presence, and lock the door behind her. What a reverse this has been. From verse 1 and 2, he loved her. He just made himself sick thinking about her. He had his way with her, and he was done. He thought it was love. It was not love. So he wasn't willing to listen to her before nor after. The text says that he was stronger. Sometimes there's that word that's used there is sometimes it's translated severe. In Genesis 41:57, the drought was going to be severe. It's heavy, weighty, strong. Now, the word hate occurs 4 times in verse 15. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up and go away. Wow, what a contrast between verse 1 and verse 15. Hate, of course, is the opposite of love. Amnon hated Tamar with an intensity that was as great as his passion had been for her. And the section ends, remember this 7 through 15? The section ends with the same command, get out. David says to her, go. Amnon says to her, get out. Same command. The winds of love, verse 1, that had propelled him so forcefully to pursue this, even taking a path of gross, disgraceful kind of sin, proved to be nothing more than a gust, the wind of lust. The wind of love was just a gust of lust. I'm turning into Dan Smith. That's sad. This is so sad. And when you read all of this and you get to verse 15 and he says what he says, you ought to be mad. You ought to be mad at the man. The man needs to be taken out back and talked to. You know what I mean? He needs to be taken out back. He has done something that's going to damage, it's going to scar this girl for the rest of her life. Indications are, as far as I remember, she never marries. There's no doubt that there is damage done, and it's tough to overcome it. Things in life remind you of things that happened before. It's kind of like a flashback kind of thing, and it affects you. It takes time, it takes maturity, God's grace to get over it. You don't ever forget it, but you have dealt with it appropriately. Any questions about all of this here? Next week we can. There will not be a Sunday night church on December 30th, so we have a couple of more weeks that we can look at. We'll probably get through chapter 13 in a couple more weeks. We need to look at verses 16 and following to see how this still plays out, and goes rather quickly because it says that what is it? 2 years elapsed, but I don't recall where does it says that right in here. There it is, verse 23. Now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. So Absalom told Tamar, his sister, to keep silent. So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Of course, David heard about it. It made him angry, verse 21. And Absalom didn't say anything to Amnon because of all this. As it turns out, 2 years later, which is a wonderful insight into sin. Sin doesn't always erupt and work its way out within a week. Absalom is exercising great patience, and he's planning this, and he finally sees an opportunity 2 years later. He doesn't forget. And he takes the opportunity of shearing the sheep. There is festival. It's a big party time when you shear the sheep. Bring Amnon up here. We'll get him drunk, and then we'll kill him.